The fire in the great hall of Ashvale had been burning for 3 hours when Cecily Hartwell understood, for the first time, that a room full of people could witness a woman's worth, being named aloud, and hold its breath as though it were watching something sacred. She stood near the long window where the curtains had been drawn against the December snow, and she did not yet know that the man crossing the room toward her had made up his mind 6 days earlier, in a corridor lit by a single lamp. When she had pressed a small painted miniature into his hands and turned away without asking for anything at all. She had come to Ashvale 6 weeks after Marcus Rowe died. That was how the household still measured time in those early weeks, not by calendar days, not by the slow turn of November into December, but by the distance from Marcus. 6 weeks since the Earl had died without a son, without a warning, without time for anyone to say the thing they had meant to say. 6 weeks since the title had passed, in the orderly and merciless fashion of English inheritance law, to the younger brother. 6 weeks since Cecily had accepted Lady Frances Rowe's offer of a position as companion, because her father's death 8 months prior had left her with a small allowance that would not carry her through another winter and a set of accomplishments, French and watercolors and the management of household accounts that were most useful in someone else's house. She had not known the new Earl of Ashvale by reputation or acquaintance. She had not known what sort of man Edmund Rowe was. She had arrived on a gray November morning in a hired coach that let her down at the east gate, and Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, had met her at the door with a ring of keys at her waist and a measuring look that softened almost immediately into something warmer. "Lady Frances is in the yellow sitting room," Mrs. Holt had said, and led her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the faint ghost of Marcus's particular tobacco. Cecily had liked Ashvale at once. She had not expected to. She had expected a house still dressed in its grief, shrouded and airless, the kind of place where a companion sat quietly in corners and was not addressed. She found instead a house that had been loved for a long time and was currently confused about its future. The portraits in the East Gallery were all of Rose across 7 generations. Marcus occupied 2 of them, one from his youth and one commissioned on the occasion of his inheriting the earldom 9 years ago. In neither of them did he look like a man who would die at 38 of a fever that had seemed at first like nothing at all. She did not look for the younger brother's face among the portraits. She was not certain in those first days that there was one. Lady Frances was 34 years old, and her grief was the kind that had settled into her bones rather than spilling out of her. She was not unkind. She told Cecily plainly what she expected. Company in the mornings, correspondence managed in the afternoons, presence at whatever small entertainments the season required of a widow still technically in the first months of mourning. She did not ask Cecily about herself beyond the practical. She did not ask about Cecily's father, or about the small Shropshire house that had been let to a tenant family now, or about the fact that Cecily owned 2 walking gowns and 1 evening gown, and had retrimmed the evening gown twice. Frances was not cruel. She was simply submerged, and she had hired a companion the way one opens a window. For the air, not for conversation about the window itself. Cecily understood this, and did not mind it. She had her own manner of occupying space without requiring much of it. It was Mrs. Holt who told her, on the 4th day, that the new Earl was expected at the end of the week. "He has been in Edinburgh," Mrs. Holt said, smoothing a length of freshly pressed linen over the back of a chair. "He was there when Lord Marcus fell ill, and he arrived 3 days too late. He has had some difficulty, I think, returning to England in the ordinary way." She said nothing further on the subject. Mrs. Holt was a woman who said precisely as much as she intended, and no more. Edmund Rowe arrived on a Friday afternoon, when the light was already going. Cecily was in the library when she heard the horses in the courtyard. She was not watching from the window. She was genuinely occupied with a letter Francis had asked her to draft to a cousin in Bath. She heard the horses, then the particular sound of a man dismounting with the controlled economy of someone accustomed to long journeys, then boots on the stone of the entrance hall below. She heard Mrs. Holt's greeting, low and formal. She heard a silence, where a response should have been, and then a voice, quiet and level, that said only, "Is Lady Frances well?" She finished the sentence she was writing and set down the pen. He came into the library 20 minutes later, when she was still there. She had not thought to leave. It had not occurred to her that the library might be considered his particular domain. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and she rose from the chair and inclined her head and said, "My lord, I am Miss Hartwell. I have the honor of serving as companion to Lady Frances." He was 31 years old, and he did not look like his portraits. He was taller than she had expected, and leaner, and his face held the particular quality of a man who had been keeping himself under strict governance for some time. His eyes were the color of wood smoke. They moved from her face to the open letter on the desk, and back to her face. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He said nothing else. She gathered the letter and the pen and the small bottle of ink, and removed herself from the library with a quiet deliberateness that she hoped conveyed neither discomfort nor haste. She was not certain she succeeded. She was 23 years old, and she had learned, in the 8 months since her father died, that her position in any room was contingent on someone else's tolerance of her presence in it. What she did not see, as she passed through the doorway, was that he turned to watch her go. The dowager arrived 11 days later, and she brought Miss Philippa Vane with her. Lady Dorothea Rowe was 58 years old, and had organized her entire adult life around the premise that rank was not merely a social convenience, but a moral structure, and that those who failed to appreciate this revealed something irreparable about their character. She entered Ashvale as though she were re-entering her own house, which, in some constitutional sense that she felt keenly, she believed she was. She embraced Frances with calibrated warmth. She surveyed the entrance hall with calibrated approval. She surveyed Cecily, who was standing 3 steps behind Frances, with no expression at all. "This is Miss Hartwell," Frances said, and her voice was careful in the way voices are when the speaker knows the ground is uncertain. "She has been a great comfort to me." "Has she?" said Lady Dorothea. Miss Vane was 20 years old, and had been raised to understand that Ashvale was a reasonable expectation. She had dark hair dressed in the fashionable way, and a complexion that required no assistance, and the kind of social confidence that comes from having been told from the age of 12 that one is precisely the right sort of person. She glanced at Cecily the way one glances at a chair that has been left in an inconvenient position. That first evening at dinner, when Cecily misread the placement of the dessert forks and rearranged them correctly before the footman could, Dorothea said to Miss Vane, just audibly, "A companion with strong opinions about cutlery. How particular." Cecily heard this. She did not respond to it. She was learning, in these weeks at Ashvale, that silence was not always capitulation. Sometimes silence was the only thing one had left to spend wisely. Edmund heard it too. He was seated at the head of the table, and his face did not change, but his hand, which had been resting on the table beside his wineglass, closed briefly into a still fist, and then opened again. Cecily did not see this. She was looking at her plate. The first snow fell the following week, a light sifting that whitened the park without obscuring it. And Cecily woke early and walked as far as the ha-ha before the cold drove her back. She had taken to rising before the household to give herself an hour that belonged to no one. She did not know that Edmund also rose early, and that he had ridden out that morning before the snow settled, and that when he returned through the kitchen garden he saw her crossing the frosted grass in her one good pair of half-boots, the hem of her gray wool gown already dark with damp, and that he checked the horse involuntarily, so that the animal sidestepped on the path and had to be steadied. She did not see him. She went inside. He remained in the saddle for a moment, looking at the place where she had been. The incident in the kitchen corridor happened on the Thursday of the following week, and this was the thing Edmund saw. Cecily had gone to the kitchen to collect Francis's tisane, a small task that the housemaid sometimes forgot in the afternoon's confusion. She found young Nell, one of the lower housemaids, in tears beside the passage door, and she found Mrs. Finch, the lady's maid Dorothea had brought from London, standing over her with an expression of compact satisfaction. Mrs. Finch was claiming that Nell had stolen a length of silk ribbon from Dorothea's traveling case. Nell was denying it with the particular inarticulate distress of a girl who is entirely innocent and has no language for how unfair this is. The ribbon was lying on the floor of the passage. It was an ordinary length of pale blue silk, the kind found in any haberdashery in England. It proved nothing. "I saw her take it," Mrs. Finch said to Cecily, in the tone of someone who had discovered she could make this claim without anyone contradicting her. "Yesterday morning, while she was in her ladyship's dressing room." "Did you see her take it?" Cecily said, and her voice was very quiet. "Or did you find it in her possession?" Mrs. Finch looked at her with the particular expression that said, "You are a companion, not a housekeeper, and you have no authority here." "I witnessed it." Cecily looked at Nell, who had wiped her face with the back of her wrist and was now standing very still, as though stillness might protect her. Then she looked at the ribbon. Then she looked at Mrs. Finch again. "Lady Dorothea's traveling case," Cecily said. "The blue one with the brass fittings. It was brought in on Monday morning. Nell was not in that part of the house on Monday morning. I know this because I saw her in the still room at 9:30, when I came to collect the lavender water Lady Francis had requested, and she was there until noon. You may ask Mrs. Holt." A silence settled in the passage. "Perhaps," Cecily said, "the ribbon simply fell from the case when it was unpacked. These things do happen." She waited. The weight of what she had just done settled quietly over her. She had made an enemy of the woman who dressed the dowager, which meant she had, in some practical sense, made an enemy of the dowager herself. Mrs. Finch knew it. Mrs. Finch's eyes said as much. With the particular precision of a woman cataloging a debt she intends to collect. Then Mrs. Finch picked up the ribbon, said nothing, and walked away. Edmund had come into the passage from the kitchen end half a minute earlier. He had come for no particular reason, or so he told himself. He had been passing, and the sounds in the corridor had been the kind of sounds that precede an injustice. He had stopped beside the stone column at the corridor's bend, where the light did not reach, and he had stood there through the entire exchange without making his presence known. He watched Cecily gather the tisane from the kitchen shelf, smooth her skirt with one hand, and walk back toward the main house. He did not move for a long moment after she had gone. If you have been as moved by Cecily's particular quiet courage as I find myself, stay with this story. What follows will ask more of her before it gives her anything in return. The midpoint of December brought the solicitor. Mr. Aldous Crane arrived from London on a Monday with a leather case and the grave, purposeful air of a man who has spent 30 years rendering complicated matters clear to people who would prefer they were not. He was there to complete the formal transfer of estate records into Edmund's name, to review the entail, to confirm that Marcus's affairs had been administered correctly in the 6 weeks since his death, He spent 2 days at Ashvale, closeted with Edmund in the study that had been Marcus's, going through documents that covered a table Marcus had used for 9 years. Cecily saw Edmund once in that stretch, in the gallery outside the study, and she saw that he had stopped in front of the portrait of Marcus at his inheritance. He stood with his back to the corridor and his arms at his sides, and he was not moving. She passed as quietly as she could, and did not look back. She did not know, and could not have known, that he had been standing there for 10 minutes, and that the thought running through him was not grief in its ordinary shape, but something colder and more specific. That he had been in Edinburgh arguing about a land survey when Marcus's fever broke its first containment, and that the 3 days it had taken him to travel south had been 3 days during which Marcus had been looking for him, and he had not been there to be found. There was a portrait of Edmund in the house, painted 8 years ago, when he was still the second son, and the world was organized accordingly. It hung at the far end of the east gallery, turned slightly to face the wall. He had turned it himself, the morning after he arrived, and he had not turned it back. Mrs. Holt had noted this and said nothing. In the study, on the corner of the table where Marcus had once kept his pen stand, there was a small painted miniature of Marcus in a gilt frame. Mr. Crane had found it among the desk papers and set it to one side. Edmund had looked at it for a long time and then covered it with a folded piece of correspondence and gone back to the documents. What he did not know was that Cecily had seen the miniature 3 days after her arrival, before Edmund came. When Frances had asked her to dust the study in the housekeeper's absence, she had looked at the small painted face for a long time. She had not touched it. The night after Mr. Crane departed, Edmund sat alone in the study with the miniature uncovered on the desk in front of him, and he understood in the particular way one understands things that arrive too late that Marcus had organized his life around the assumption of more time, and that there was nothing to be done about this now, and that the earldom and the estate and the portraits in the gallery were his, and would remain his, and that this was not what he had wanted. He put the miniature in the top drawer of the desk and locked it. 3 days later, he found it was gone. He stood in the study for a long moment, and then a thought arrived that was neither fair nor charitable, and he dismissed it. But it returned. Cecily Hartwell had access to this room. She was, by her own description, companion to Lady Frances. He did not know her. He had not known to know her. The miniature was the only object of Marcus's that he had kept on the desk rather than in storage, and now it was not there, and he was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He said nothing about this to anyone. Lady Dorothea had been building toward something for 2 weeks, and she completed it on a Wednesday. She came to Frances in the small sitting room and spoke for 20 minutes about household economy, about the expense of maintaining a companion in a household already supporting a dowager countess's staff, about the propriety of the arrangement now that a young unmarried earl was in residence. She was not unkind in her delivery. She was scrupulous in her delivery, which was worse. She said that she and Miss Vane were of course happy to provide Lady Frances with all the company she required, and that Miss Hartwell's position, while it had served an immediate need, was no longer quite what the household required. She said Miss Hartwell twice. The second time, she said it the way one says the name of a piece of furniture that has been placed in the wrong room. Frances received this and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I will speak with her." She was not unkind to Cecily either. She came to Cecily's room that evening and sat in the chair by the window and said that circumstances had altered, that she hoped Cecily understood, that she had written a letter of character that would serve her very well in any household she applied to. She was making arrangements for Cecily to travel to her cousin in Wiltshire until a suitable position presented itself. She would see to the coach fare. Cecily sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to all of this and said, "I understand, Lady Frances. Thank you for your kindness." After Frances left, she sat without moving for a considerable time. She was being put out of the house she had, in some secret and inadvisable way, begun to think of as a place she belonged. She had nowhere definite to go. The cousin in Wiltshire was her father's cousin, and barely known to her. She had £32 in the small box under the bed, which would last 6 weeks if she was careful, and the letter of character, which would eventually produce another position in another household where she would sit in corners and be useful without being seen. She was not the sort of woman who wept for practical difficulties. She had learned this about herself 8 months ago, when she had stood in the solicitor's office in Shrewsbury and received the news of her father's estate and felt not tears, but a cold and clarifying stillness, the sensation of a world reorganizing itself around what was true rather than what she had hoped. She felt that now, and it helped her think. She thought about the miniature. She had taken it. This was the truth she had not shared with anyone, and it lived in her now with considerable weight. She had returned to the study 3 days after Edmund arrived, because she had remembered it was there, and she had thought, in her careful way, that a man newly arrived to the shock of his inheritance might need to see his brother's face without having to search for it. She had taken it to clean the gilt frame, which was tarnished, and she had wrapped it in a cloth and placed it on her nightstand, intending to return it the following morning. And then the days had accumulated, and she had not found the right moment. And now she was leaving. She would return it before she went. She did not go to the study. She went, instead, the following evening at dusk, to the corridor outside the estate room where Edmund had been working since Mr. Crane departed, and she knocked once on the half-open door, and when he said, "Come in," she pushed it open. He was standing by the fire with a glass of wine he had not touched. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent several days governing a suspicion he is not proud of. She held out the miniature. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "The frame was tarnished when I saw it. I took it to clean it, and I did not return it promptly, which was my error. I am sorry for it. I am leaving the day after tomorrow, and I did not want to take it with me by accident." He did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the room and took the miniature from her hand. He looked at the small painted face, and she saw something move through him that he had not permitted her to see before, a grief that he had kept behind the strict governance of his face, and for a single moment it was simply present in the room between them, like a third person. "He held the earldom for 9 years, Edmund said very quietly. "He would have held it for 40. "Yes," Cecily said. He did not say anything else. Neither did she. She turned and left the corridor, and she did not hear him move behind her, and she did not look back, because she was not leaving anything behind except the thing she had borrowed. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. What she did not know was that Frances, the following morning, went to Edmund before Cecily rose, and sat across from him in the study, and said plainly, because Frances was a woman who had run out of patience with obliquity. She protected Nell from an accusation she knew to be false, and accepted every consequence of it without complaint. She has managed my correspondence, my accounts, and my hours since she arrived without once making me feel her goodness as a reproach. She asked me for nothing. She is leaving because your mother told me she should. And your mother told me she should because she wants Philippa installed in this house. And I will not pretend I do not know this." She paused. "That is all I wish to say." Edmund listened to this with his hands flat on the desk. Then he said, She returned Marcus's miniature last evening. Frances looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I saw her take it to clean it. I should have told you immediately. I am sorry. He was quiet for a long time after Frances left. The winter gathering had been planned before Dorothea arrived, a modest affair by Ashvale's former standards, 20 or so neighbors and local families invited for the last evening of November's obligations. Edmund had not cancelled it. It had seemed, in the weeks of organizing, like a reasonable domestic event, and he had neither the energy nor the desire to explain an absence to 20 families. Cecily had not expected to attend. She was, after all, leaving. She had packed her 2 trunks. The coach had been arranged for the following morning. She sat that evening in her room with a book she could not read. And then she heard the carriage wheels on the gravel below, and the particular sound of a house receiving guests. And she set the book down. Mrs. Holt knocked on her door at 7:30. "His lordship has asked that you come down," Mrs. Holt said, and her voice had the warmth of a woman who knows more than she is presently being invited to say. "He said to tell you that Lady Frances would benefit from your company." Cecily looked at Mrs. Holt for a moment, and Mrs. Holt looked back at her with the steady equanimity of a woman who has managed Ashvale through more uncertainty than most would survive. She changed into the evening gown, which she had retrimmed last month with a length of ivory ribbon from Mrs. Holt's workroom. She went downstairs. The great hall was lit with 24 candles in the chandelier and the candelabra along the walls, and the fire in the hearth was enormous and warm, and the room held perhaps 18 people in their winter finery, and Cecily stood in the doorway for a moment and understood that she was underdressed in a way that could not be concealed, and that this had ceased to frighten her in the way it once had. She found Frances near the window and stood beside her. And Frances took her hand briefly and released it. And that small gesture steadied her. Dorothea saw her within 3 minutes. She was standing with Miss Vane and 2 neighboring matrons, and when her gaze found Cecily across the room, her expression moved through several arrangements before settling on the kind of composure that conceals a decision. She said something to Miss Vane. Miss Vane's gaze moved to Cecily, and then away. And she smiled, the small, certain smile of a woman who believes the conclusion is already written. Edmund was at the far end of the room. He had been speaking with Mr. Aldous Crane, who had returned from London to deliver the final sealed documents confirming the letters patent in their completed form, a formality that had been delayed by a question of precedence in the College of Heralds, and had now been resolved. Crane stood beside him with a leather case and the expression of a man performing his last official function of the evening before removing himself to supper. Dorothea began moving across the room toward Cecily and Frances at a measured pace that was not quite a crossing and not quite a stroll. Miss Vane followed. The 2 neighboring matrons watched with the attentive interest of people who sense that something is about to be publicly decided. "Miss Hartwell?" Dorothea said, arriving at the window. She said the name with the particular weight of a verdict being repeated for the record. "I had not realized you were still in the house. I understood arrangements had been made." "They have been made," Cecily said. Her voice was level. "And yet here you are," Dorothea said, and her smile was the kind calibrated to leave no mark. "I suppose a gathering of this modest sort does not require the usual distinctions of company." She looked at Miss Vane and then at the matrons across the room, including them in the small precision of the remark. Cecily held herself very still. She was aware of the ribbon of ivory at her neckline, resewn that morning in the gray light of her room. She was aware of the fire's warmth. She was aware that she had £32 in the box upstairs and a coach leaving at 8 in the morning, and that there was nothing in this room she could claim as her own. She heard footsteps behind her. Not the sound of approach, but the sound of arrival, deliberate, unhurried, the particular quality of someone who has decided where he is going. Edmund stopped beside her. Not behind her. Not at a social distance. Beside her. He said nothing for a moment, and the room reorganized itself around the fact of where he was standing. Then he said, "Mother." And his voice was very quiet and very clear. "You have spent the better part of this visit informing everyone willing to listen that Miss Hartwell is a poor relation at best and a convenience at worst. I want to correct that account while the people who heard it are still in the room." Dorothea looked at him. Her expression did not change. It could not afford to. "Edmund," she said, and her voice carried the full weight of 31 years of maternal authority. "This is neither the moment nor the occasion." "It is exactly the occasion," he said. "You arranged for her dismissal. You did this in a house she had served with more steadiness and integrity than most I have known. And you did it because she was not Philippa, and Philippa was what you had decided this house required." He did not look at Miss Vane. He looked only at his mother, and his voice did not rise above its ordinary level, which made it more difficult to dismiss than any volume could have achieved. "You were wrong." The room was entirely still. Mrs. Holt stood near the servant's door with her hands folded, and she was very still too, but her face held the expression of a woman whose judgment has been confirmed. Dorothea said, "You cannot know this woman. You have known her 3 weeks. I have known her long enough to watch her refuse an injustice when the cost of refusal was entirely her own," he said. "I have known her long enough to understand what she did for Marcus's memory when she had no obligation to do anything at all." He paused. "I have known her long enough." He turned then and looked at Cecily, and what was in his face had been there for 3 weeks in small pieces, accumulated in corridors and in the library again, and in the kitchen garden seen through a half-frosted window. And she saw all of it at once, and felt it arrive in her chest like the first warm air after a very long winter. "Miss Hartwell?" he said. "Cecily." Her first name in his voice was a distinct event. "I would ask you to stay. Not as companion to Lady Frances. As mistress of this house, if you will have it and me." She did not say yes immediately. She held it for a moment, because she was the kind of woman who did not surrender important things to the first warmth offered. Then she said, very quietly, "I will." Miss Vane stood at Dorothea's shoulder, and her face held, for a single instant, the expression of a woman understanding that the script she had memorized was not the one being performed. Then she lowered her gaze with a grace that was real, if not entirely comfortable, and she said nothing. And this was probably the wisest thing she had done in some time. Dorothea looked at her son for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Not warm, not exactly, but the particular movement of a woman who has encountered a fact she cannot arrange around. She said, "You are your father's son," and it was not entirely a compliment, and it was not entirely a reproach. And Edmund received it with the measured quiet of a man who has learned that some things can only be acknowledged, not resolved. "Mr." Crane cleared his throat quietly, sealed the leather case, and withdrew toward the supper room with the tact of a man who has learned over 30 years that his function is to make things clear, not to witness their aftermath. Frances, who had been standing at Cecily's left throughout all of this, took Cecily's hand again briefly, and this time she held it. In the quiet that followed, the snow beyond the long windows increased its industry, and the fire in the great hearth had nothing to say about any of it, but burned steadily regardless. There is a particular warmth that comes from being chosen in the very room where you were told you were not worth choosing. If you have ever felt that warmth, you will not need to be told what Cecily felt that night, If you have not, stay close. This story has one more thing to give you. The winter settled fully over Ashvale in the days that followed. The guests departed the morning after the gathering in their carriages, carrying with them the thing that guests always carry from country houses: a story. In this case, the story was not unflattering to anyone who deserved flattering. Dorothea departed 2 days later with Miss Vane and Mrs. Finch and the blue traveling case, and she went in a manner that preserved her dignity without requiring a great deal of warmth on anyone's part. She said goodbye to Edmund in the hall and to Francis in the sitting room, and she looked at Cecily for a moment before she left and said, "You will find the house requires a firm hand," which was the closest she could come, Cecily understood, to a kind of welcome. Frances stayed. She had not decided this before the gathering, but she had decided it sometime during it, watching Edmund cross the room, and she told Cecily over breakfast the following morning that she intended to remain at Ashvale as long as she was wanted, which she expected to be indefinitely. She was not ready, she said, to leave Marcus's house. Cecily thought this was perfectly reasonable. She thought it would remain perfectly reasonable for quite some time. Mr. Crane's documents were filed in the estate office in their proper order. The letters patent confirming Edmund as Earl of Ashvale sat in the case behind the desk, sealed and certain, as letters patent had been sealed and certain for many generations before them. Mrs. Holt presided over the household with the unaltered efficiency of a woman whose equilibrium has survived 11 years at Ashvale and is not unduly impressed by any single winter. Cecily moved her 2 trunks from the companion's room to a room 3 doors along the east corridor that had better light and a window that looked over the park. She retrimmed nothing. She did not need to. On the Sunday after the gathering, when the snow had stopped and the park lay in its white simplicity under a pale morning sky, Edmund took the miniature of Marcus from the desk drawer and carried it to the east gallery. He stood in front of the portrait of Marcus at his inheritance for a long moment, and then he set the miniature on the narrow shelf below the portrait, where it could be seen properly. Then he walked to the far end of the gallery to his own portrait, which had been facing the wall since November, and he turned it to face the room. He stood back and looked at both of them together for a moment. Then he looked out the gallery window at the snow. Cecily came into the gallery a few minutes later, looking for him. She stopped when she saw the portraits. She looked at Marcus's miniature on the shelf below his larger likeness, and then she looked at Edmund's portrait facing the room, and then she looked at Edmund. He said, "Marcus would have liked you." She said, "I think I would have liked him." A pause settled between them, easy and warm. The kind of pause that is available only to people who are no longer calculating the cost of saying the wrong thing. She crossed the gallery to stand beside him, and they looked out the window together at the white expanse of the park, and the snow that had stopped falling still held the light in its particular way, and the house was quiet around them, in the manner of houses that have been waiting a long time for the right kind of quiet, and have finally received it. The fire in the great hearth had been burning all morning. Marcus looked out from his portrait at both of them, at his brother, and this woman his brother had chosen. And if the dead can be satisfied by what the living manage to do with the time they have, then perhaps Marcus was. At any rate, the miniature sat below his portrait in the gilt frame, its tarnish cleaned away, catching the winter light that came through the long gallery windows, and the house went on in all its rooms and its corridors and its cold kitchen garden, and Ashvale was, for the first time in 6 weeks, simply itself, complete, held, and not yet done. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you knew Edmund had already decided. These are the moments worth returning to.